돌아갔습니다. 이제 하면 되죠?
네.
에릭도 하면 됩니까? 예. Religion gives the deepest spiritual insight, but there are also some of the dumbest concepts also could be very foolish. There is person who has revealed this point sharply and opened a new phase for human growth and evolution. Dr. Ken Wilber, pioneer of integrated psychology. I came from Seoul to Denver to meet you. Yeah. My friend is the head of the publishing company that has published about 10 of your books.
Oh,
Uh,
that's great.
yeah. Here are many of your leaders in Korea. I ask question on behalf of those. Amazing. How did you know that secret? Discover the fact that those who realized were enlightened are not actually perfect. You are smart enough to know it when you stay in your house, but I've wandered around book by book for over 3 years, met countless mountain monks from Korea, and met many monks in the Himalaya, India, Nepal, Cambodia, Japan, China, Myanmar, also Thailand, many countries.
Right.
I've met people who have been enlightened.
Right.
I know their charm strengths, but also I know their limitation problems.
Right.
Yeah.
And their weaknesses.
Yeah. And weakness. I once thought that if I realized was enlightened, all the problem would be solved. But in reality, there are not many people who realize are enlightened, that they have experienced something that cannot control their desire in reality, have personality problems, and are vulnerable to sex scandals or money problems. When and how did you know that? And what made you think integrated growth was necessary in addition to traditional spiritual awakening?
Okay, thank you. My overall philosophy is generally called integral theory. And it's called integral because it integrates virtually all aspects of reality. So it will integrate science and religion and philosophy and sociology and psychology and on and on. And I've literally developed this outlook in over 35 books. So there's a lot of material in those 35 books. Part of the material in the 35 books is what I call the integral framework. And there are several different ways to describe what's integrated in this framework. A common way that I would have to explain, and I will shortly, is quadrants, levels, lines, states, and types. And those are all various categories that I pull together into a single unified framework. And another way to describe that framework is that it consists in the practices of waking up, growing up, opening up, cleaning up, and showing up. And the first two are particularly relevant to this question because waking up is not the same as growing up. Waking up is when you undertake a meditative or contemplative practice that leads to enlightenment. And the other section is growing up. And growing up refers to, well, it's generally attributed to Sigmund Freud. But this was only discovered about 100 years ago. Freud wrote his first book in 1895. But the paths of waking up go much further back. Some of them to 4,000, 5,000, 6,000 years BC. And they are involved again in this path of waking up or enlightenment. Whereas growing up studies the actual stages that all human beings go through from birth to middle age, to adolescence, to young adulthood, to old adulthood. And it maps out these stages very carefully, and it compares them with an enormous amount of research. And what they found is that all the different lines of development, such as cognitive development, emotional development, aesthetic development, spiritual development, they all went through the same levels or stages of growing up. Now, the first types of self-improvement that humanity had were paths of waking up, or enlightenment, or awakening. They were completely unaware of the stages of growing up, because most people don't look at like they have a baby and they watch him grow, but they don't realize that he's actually going through different stages of his own cognitive capacity, his emotional capacity, his aesthetic capacity, his moral capacity, his spiritual capacity. And yet every single human being has available to them the main stages of growing up. And so when this became fairly well known, again around 100 years ago with Sigmund Freud, it really threw the paths of waking up into a certain turmoil, because this is all brand new to them. They had never heard of stages of growing up before. So these stages of growing up have been studied now by dozens, even hundreds of different researchers, and they each give these different stages of growing up, they tend to give it their own name. So Piaget in cognitive development, for example, named them natural intelligence, then pre-operational intelligence, which is the intelligence of a young child in its magic and mythic stages. And then they move from pre-operational thinking into concrete operational thinking, which tends to be mythic in structure and deals with concretely operating on the world, hence it's called concrete operational thinking. And then from concrete operational thinking, we develop formal operational thinking, which is not thought operating on the world, but thought operating on thought. Gene Gebser was another very famous investigator of these stages of growing up. And he gave them the names, the archaic stage, the magic stage, the mythic stage, the rational stage, the pluralistic stage, and the integral stage. And those are all very different types of thought operating on thought. They're very different types of thinking itself. And the problem is something can go wrong at any stage. So the common defense mechanism that Freud discovered is repression. So at any stage of development, if you don't like what's going on, you can repress it. You can push it out of your mind. You can push it into what Freud called the unconscious. And when it's there, number one, you forget about it. You lose track of it. Cool component. It's all shoved underground. It's all shoved into the basement. And even if you're practicing a waking up meditation, that's not going to help you dig into your unconscious and dig those hidden parts out. Waking up simply won't do that. Waking up meditation is a form of witnessing practice where whatever arises in your mind, you allow it to arise and you witness it. So if you have a thought, I'm hungry, then you're just aware of I'm hungry. And if you are frightened, you're just aware of, oh, I have fear. And you just simply bring anything that crosses your experience into your awareness. Now, if you continue doing that, the ultimate result is known as enlightenment or awakening. And it's called those terms, it's called like awakening, because it really feels like you're waking up from a long sleep to a very real and new reality. And this enlightened reality is one with the everything. You become one with the entire universe. And most religions, particularly the early forms of religion, called that enlightenment or awakening or God. But it was a very profound experiential unification of everything in your world. The problem with the stages of growing up is that if you get something that goes wrong at a particular stage, the archaic stage, the magic stage, the mythic stage, the rational stage, the pluralistic stage, or even the integral stage, it becomes seals off from your awareness. It's actually unconscious. It's repressed. It's pushed out of your awareness. So no matter how good or enlightened your awareness becomes, and you've got a growing up problem hidden in the basement, enlightened awareness won't fix that. It can't get to that. You have to undertake specific training and practices and go to psychotherapy or psychoanalysis or something like that to get at this repressed, hidden material. Even if you have a profound enlightenment awakening or experience, you can still, the part of you that you're aware of will feel like it's one with everything. And you will definitely feel that. And it's a real unity. You really are one with the entire universe. But that doesn't make you perfect if you've got growing up hidden problems, because your awareness can't reach them. That's the definition of the unconscious, is you split it off from your awareness. So your awareness has no way to get to it. And so even if you have a profound waking up enlightenment experience, that won't cure your hidden, repressed, growing up problems. That's why I include both waking up and growing up in my overall integral framework. They're both very important, and they're probably the two most important paths of growing that we've discovered. And the one, again, is a full enlightenment, a realization that you're one with everything that's arising. You're one with this world. You're one with the stars. You're one with the galaxies. You're one with the whole universe. And that's a very real, it's often in religious terms called the ground of all being. Because what you're becoming one with is indeed the ground of all being, or the ground of all individual things. They exist because of this ground of all being. And because that simply required an waking up experience. It required a certain awareness. But as long as you haven't split that awareness off or repressed it, you generally have access to it. So most people, if they undertake a serious practice of meditation or waking up practice, they will indeed, sometimes it takes a year or two, or occasionally 3, they will have what Zen Buddhism calls a satori, an experience of being one with everything. But that, again, doesn't make you perfect because it doesn't get at the hidden shadow repressed elements in your own being. Those are still there, they're still repressed, and they're still causing problematic neurotic symptoms and diseases and neurosis and uncomfortableness. And you're just stuck with that unless you go into some form of psychotherapeutic practice that will dig into your unconscious and get at those hidden elements and bring them to the surface. So very few people are perfect in the sense of completely awakened and completely free of all neurosis and hidden shadow elements and so on. Very few people have completely woken up and completely grown up. And that becomes obvious when you interact with them. You can see something is a little off, or they're not quite happy, or something's not right in them. And so we definitely recommend that when anybody is looking to improve themselves in any way, they take up a path of waking up or meditation or contemplation, and they start some form of growing up psychotherapy. So they are addressing both of these fundamental areas of what should be our own whole being. So as you say, even though you might realize enlightenment, they have experienced something that they cannot control their desires in reality. They have personality problems and are vulnerable to sex scandals or money problems. All of those are problems with our stages of growing up. Something has gone wrong. The earlier the stage that goes wrong, generally the worse the condition, the problem is. So somebody that has serious problems in the first year of life, that's where a boundary is being created between self and not self. They'll have trouble forming that boundary, and they might very well experience a psychosis. And Freud divided personality problems into the really serious ones that were called psychoses. And that included things like schizophrenia and people that hallucinate or hear voices or see things and so on. So that's a very serious psychotic problem. So psychosis. And then at the more normal end, if a person has troubles growing up when they're 5, 6, 7 years old, sometime around there, generally during the magic to mythic stage of development, then Freud called that a neurosis. And a neurosis is just a mental problem, a psychological problem. But it's not a serious psychosis where yourself isn't formed right. And so you're hearing things or seeing things or having just an enormous anxiety and fear. A neurosis is more like a little bit of jealousy or envy or anger or small amounts of fear or anxiety or depression and so on. And that's what most people go to therapists for. It's some form of neurosis, which is a real problem, but it's not a serious psychosis problem. But both psychosis and neurosis come from faults in the growing up stage. And so that's where they have to be dealt with. So that's my response to the question about why enlightenment doesn't give a perfection. Because enlightenment, waking up itself, doesn't deal with the problems of growing up. And that's where most neuroses and all psychoses originate. And if you don't deal with them on their own terms by undergoing some sort of therapy, You'll remain stuck with them, even if you get a very profound enlightenment experience. So we have to watch out for both sides of the street. Okay, this is another variation on the process of enlightenment that I've introduced small amounts of. And the practice, when you sit down to practice an integrated mindfulness, is you first of all assume the stance of a witness. Now, a witness is that in us which is aware. So it's sometimes called the big self or the real self or an authentic self. But we're all aware right now of the thoughts going through our mind. But we can also be aware that there is an awareness of those thoughts. So there's a real self that is witnessing all of my thoughts. And I can actually, if I think about it, I can feel into that real witness. The more I let go of my small mind, because as I rest in the witness, I'm resting in big mind, or my real mind, or my real self. And that ends up letting us transcend or move beyond our small self. And that's the general instructions that you're given in any integrated path of waking up. Now, when I say integrated, I don't mean that they include all the bases, that they include growing up and opening up and cleaning up and showing up and the full spectrum of quadrants, levels, lines, states, and types. No meditation practice includes all of those, except the ones that I've introduced, having to do specifically with the integral approach. But otherwise, most of these meditation systems that go back 4,000, 5,000, 6,000 years ago, Zen Buddhism or Vedanta Hinduism or contemplative Taoism or Christian mysticism, all of those work with this sort of big witness awareness. And they try to get us in touch with that witness awareness, because in Christian terms, that witness awareness is one with God. And as I said, that big self is one with everything, but it's certainly one with the ground of all being. It's one with God. It's one with the fullness and reality of the entire universe. And when people first stumbled upon that type of realization, it had a huge impact on them. So most of the people that had a very powerful enlightenment or awakening or meditative experience founded specific individual religions. So Jesus Christ was one such person. He had a profound experience that I and the Father are one. I and this ground of all being are united. We are the same thing. Christ was claiming, in other words, that he was one with God. And everybody who had that enlightenment experience of waking up felt that they were one with this ground of all being, that they were one with God. And you find that in the mystics of every single religion worldwide, the mystics being those who have a contemplative, unifying experience, a waking up experience. And the mystics of all the world's religions tend to agree with each other. If a Buddhist mystic meets a Christian mystic, they'll immediately have things to talk about that they share. They'll have similarities of experiential unity and oneness and so on. But when the outer forms of world's religions, they all differ from each other decisively, because they're coming from the outer forms and the earlier forms of thinking. So they're either magical religions or mythic religions. And most forms of Christian fundamentalism are mythic forms of religion. And so they'll say things like, oh, there's one and only one God, and we need to pray daily to that one God. And the one God is called Jehovah. And Jehovah, the way it's actually used, is no different from any other mythic gods. It's the same as Zeus, Apollo, Aphrodite, Mars, Jupiter. I mean, it's the same fundamental form of mythic thinking that predominates childhood from age 6 or 7 on to adolescence, when formal operational or rationality first emerges. And when rationality first emerges, it tends to be very scientific. And therefore, starting around adolescent rationality, science and religion get into fights. That is to say, typical science and ordinary mythic forms of religion, because they just don't agree with each other. Science looks at rationality and reason and experiments to discover the truth, whereas religion is usually just the report of somebody who has made up a lot of stories built around a mythic god. So it's the same. The Greeks had an enormous amount of mythology. They just never got religion because nobody ever hooked it up to a type of waking up experience. But what I'm saying for this integrated mindfulness, please introduce it, is that we follow the same basic instructions that are given for waking up to all people. And all forms of waking up everywhere rely on finding this very real witness awareness that's witnessing your thoughts right now. And you notice that if you identify as that witness, you're no longer focused on the separate thoughts. So you're no longer identified with your mere thinking apparatus. You're identified with the witness of your thinking. And that is what brings you the special enlightened oneness. And that's what makes it so profound.
Is the purpose of meditation, spiritual awakening? What do we ultimately gain through spiritual awakening? According to you, people first see the world only through the eyes of flesh. You said that by keeping the eyes of reason and rationality, the theory of geocentrism, not the theory of paleocentrism, was found. You then said people should open their eyes to contemplation through meditation. Does meditation mean to open the eyes of contemplation? Then why is it necessary to open the eyes of contemplation?
Yes, you actually mentioned 3 different types of seeing or awareness or mind. And according to the Christian mystics, we all have at least 3 eyes that we can look through. The eye of flesh, the eye of mind or reason, and the eye of spirit or contemplation. So, and you mentioned the eye of flesh, and then you say by keeping the eyes of reason, we develop the geocentric theory instead of the heliocentric theory. But then when we open the eye of spirit, or the eye of contemplation, then that is the breakthrough to this ground of all being. That's the breakthrough to this ultimate oneness that you are. And so when you say, does meditation mean to open the eyes of contemplation? Yes, if it's done correctly and essentially fully, then what you get with meditation is the opening of a new set of eyes. This is why it's often you feel like you're just waking up. It's literally like you just were sound asleep and then you opened your eyes and looked out to the eyes of flesh. But if you were meditating, it would be the eye not of flesh and not of mind, but the eye of contemplation. And so you would see a fully unified spiritual world. And that's what the eye of contemplation is supposed to give us, is a full understanding of and an actual oneness with the real world, this ground of all being. And you can't get it through the eye of flesh. You can't even get reason through the eye of flesh. What you get is seeing, hearing, tasting, smelling, sensing. And none of those are rational, and they're certainly not contemplative. But by the time we hit adolescence, we have developed a new cognitive capacity that Piaget called formal operational thinking. And that, again, is not thought operating on the world, but thought operating on thought. So that's a formal operational thinking, of thinking that reflects on itself. And that is, that is the opening of the mind's eye, the eye of reason, or the eye of rationality. And it's a very important discovery. And when it became a widespread availability to humankind, which happened in around the 14th and 15th century Common Era in the West, this is also exactly the same dates that modern science first emerged. Galileo and Kepler were the first ones to say, nature is best understood through measurement. It meant you rationally would measure the world, and those measurements would add up and you derive scientific laws from them. And all of that started to spring up in 1500, 1600, 1700 in the modern West. So we had the rise of modern physics, modern astrology, modern biology, modern geology, modern mathematics even. And they all came from opening the eye of mind, the eye of reason. But then some people at virtually any time during that could go further. And they would actually use rationality to think beyond rationality. So they would move from the eye of reason into the eye of contemplation. And there they would have a truly mystical experience. And everybody who had this mystical enlightenment experience experienced essentially the same thing, which is this unified ground of all being. And that ground of all being just hit them in the face like a sledgehammer. I mean, it's an extraordinary experience that you actually would wake up and realize that you were one with the entire universe. That's a big deal. And that's what the eye of contemplation gives you.
I want to hear a spiritual experience that opened your mind eyes. And can you tell me about your psychological and spiritual changes after that experience?
Yes. I've had several such experiences throughout my lifetime. I mean, after all, I'm 74 years old now, so I've been around a while. And I had my first and earliest awakening experience in my mid-teens. And I can remember it still to this day incredibly clearly. I had been watching a TV show, and it was about forms of torture that humankind has used on other humans throughout history. And I was watching all of these horrifying images of people having their eyes poked out or being hung up by their thumbs or just subjected to immense amount of torture. And I had just started meditating at the time. And after I finished watching the horrifying show, I went in and sat down on my meditation mat. And the first thing I thought of was, you would never be able to endure any of that. And then it was as if a voice, it wasn't really a voice, but it was a lot sort of like a voice, came to me and it said, yes, in fact, you can endure it, and you have endured all of those forms. And exactly at that moment, I broke with my separate small self and identified with this real self, this pure witness awareness. And of course, I had experienced all those forms of torture because according to all the mystical traditions worldwide, there's only one self. And it's the same self in you, same self in me, same self in him and her. And that is the witness. And so when we're fully identified with that witnessing part of ourselves, then we're identified with that complete ground of all being. That also means that we have gone through the experiences that every other person has gone through, because they also have the same, ultimately, the same one self. And all the mystical traditions worldwide, of course, claim there's one God, one self, one reality, and it's called Brahman, or the Tao, or Dharmakaya. And that single unified ground is what is in each of us looking out through the eyes of flesh, the eye of mind, and the eye of contemplation. And we're witnessing through that self right now. Each and every one of us is experiencing from that pure self, that pure witness. We don't realize that because we don't identify with the witness. We identify with the smaller self that can be seen. And we know exactly what our self is because we're looking at this small, individual, localized, small self. We're not identifying with this big mind, big witness that's witnessing everything and identifying with nothing. It's just with great equanimity witnessing everything that arises moment to moment to moment. And when we get into that witnessing state of seeing everything arise moment to moment to moment, and it's no longer our subject, it's no longer ourself. So we're transcending that small self through the eye of contemplation and through witnessing. And when we do that, then we are literally one with everything, that entire ground of all being. And that's the experience that I had just seconds after I thought, oh, there's no way I could experience that horrible torture. And then I heard this voice say, yes, you could experience, and you already have experienced. That was yourself you were watching being tortured, because there's only one self in existence, and you're it. So of course you experienced that torture. And of course you've experienced enlightenment and waking up, and you've gone through stages of growing up. I mean, all of that's true. But that was the experience that I had, was this sense of profound oneness with everything that was arising. And I was all of that. I was one with the entire universe. And the changes in me, you ask about psychological and spiritual changes, they were just that from that point forward, I was fundamentally identified with this real self, aware of objects. It's a huge subject that's one with all objects. It's one with everything that's arising. And therefore, I just simply witness everything that's arising because it's arising within me. I am one with all of this. And that is the ground of all being. And that became vividly alive for me. And that's the major change, both psychologically and spiritually, that I experienced from contemplation.
You didn't divide object and subject, not divide.
Yeah.
You are and object only one.
Right.
Yeah.
Right.
You offer the pace to growth as offers to pace to awakening. However, there are many people who give up on improving, changing, or growing their weakness altogether. Therefore, there are some people who accept their natural personality and think that living in their personality is growth. In Korea, there is a saying that if you change suddenly, you die. Some people say that enlightenment is not about changing, but about accepting one's limitations and weakness as it is. What do you think about this?
Well, let me go back to the first sentence that you offered. You said you can offer a path to growth as opposed to a path to awakening. And that's not exactly correct. I didn't offer one as opposed to the other. I offered one as including the other. And I was very specifically said, including waking up and growing up is a central part of an integral approach. So we want both waking up or enlightenment experiences or contemplation, and we want growing up or changing, going from stage to stage, from archaic to magic to mythic to rational to pluralistic to integral. And so both of those are important. It's important that we wake up to this ultimate true self, or this one reality, where subject and object are non-dual or not two. So we don't see that far wall. You don't see that wall. That wall is actually arising right where you thought your head was. It's one with your awareness. And so you notice that the only organ of your body that you can't see is actually your head. And Douglas Harding wrote a book called On Having No Head. And it was specifically about enlightenment. And he said, notice that when you look around, you can't really see your head. If you get a mirror to look at it, and you're looking at a reflection in the mirror, you're not looking actually at your head. What is really happening is you don't have a head in your present experience. But where you thought your head was arising is everything that you're looking at. And that's true. Right now, if you're looking at me, at this wall, at this sofa, that's actually arising right where you thought your head was. And that's what you see. So it's arising right on your shoulders. And that wall is actually sitting right here on this side of my face. It's not out there on that side of my face. So I don't have a head because I have everything. I'm one with everything that's arising. And that means that, I mean, if you change suddenly, you die. Well, that's not a very good axiom to live by. Because we said that enlightenment itself is like waking up. And suddenly, very suddenly, when you have an enlightenment, you go from not realizing the unity of everything to immediately feeling and seeing on your head this huge unity of everything that's arising. You are that. It's actually arising right where you thought your head was. And there's no separation between where you thought your head was and everything that's arising. It's all arising on your head. So you have both quick changes, and you want to go through the process of growing up, which is a long, regular growth process, where you go from an archaic stage, which dominates the first year or so of life, and there's no clear separation between your body and the world. It's not because you're enlightened and become one with the world, it's just that you haven't yet formed a solid self-structure. So this is what Piaget called pre-operational thinking, because it's not magic, it's not mythic, it's not rational, it's just a sensory immersion in what's arising around you. And then you grow into magic, and magic is often called word magic, because what a young child will do is confuse the word of a thing with the actual thing itself. So if you change the word, you magically change the thing. And children will talk like that all the time. So they think that if they hide under a pillow and they can't see you, that they're hidden from your view and you can't see them magically. And that sort of thinking goes on throughout the so-called magical period, which is around 2 to 4 years or so. And then myths start to emerge. Jehovah, Zeus, Apollo, Aphrodite, and so on. And the whole mythic world comes crashing into existence. And you no longer have magic, but all the gods do have magic. So a god can perform a task for you if you approach that god correctly with prayer or worship or something like that. Then if you pray to this god correctly, that god will make your crops grow, or get you the girl, or get you the brand new car, or whatever it is. That's because all gods have magic. All mythic gods are magical in their structure. And then as you move into beyond the mythic stage, into the rational stage during early adolescence, then that's when you start to tend to think what's called scientifically. And you form formal operational cognition, and you start to think in rational scientific terms. So the first thing you tend to do is ditch all those magic mythic gods. They just are confused thinking. There aren't really mythic gods floating around everywhere and doing whatever you want if you pray to them correctly. And that's where you get this historic huge battle between science and religion. Even though mystical religion has always fit with rational science, because the mystics are one with everything. And so they certainly include science in what their views are. So that's well, that's an important part of the growth process. And the growth process is not opposed to the awakening process. They both are required. They're both very important parts of your awareness. So one part is this witness that is one with everything it witnesses, but then you still do have a relative self. It's not your real self. You're not identified fully with it, but it is present. You do go from archaic to magic to mythic to rational to pluralistic to integral stages of growth. And your small self is going through each and every one of those. And it's important that you traverse those fairly successfully. Because if you screw up, if you get something wrong, then you have something wrong at a stage of growing up. And that at its worst end, as we said, it's a psychosis. And at its more normal end, it's a neurosis. But neither one of those are good things. And they happen because you made a mistake. And you cut off some portion of yourself, sealed it out of awareness, and repressed it. And that caused neurosis to psychosis. So what we want to do is integrate waking up and growing up, and make sure that at each stage of growing up, we have access to our waking up true self, or our witness. And when we bring both of those together, we're very close to a truly integrated or unified being. And that's a very remarkable occurrence.
You said we shouldn't rely on meditation to solve shadows problem. If we have emotional problems, we should do healing work separately. You say shadows are too subtle to be subject to self-awareness. Is there a best way to discover psychological shadow or hidden maps?
Yes, first of all, there are many different ways to deal with shadow elements. And so there are many different forms of psychotherapy. There's Freudian psychotherapy, Jungian, Carl Jung psychotherapy, Fritz Perls, who invented something called Gestalt therapy. And I happen to believe that there is one of these treatments that are better than the others. So we could call that the best treatment if we're careful what we mean by that. And that is, let's say you have a boss who's extremely over-controlling. So he's very dominating, pushy boss. And most people have had some sort of boss that fell somewhat into that category of being very controlling and very domineering and very pushy. And you are getting very upset with your boss. And this over-controlling is driving you crazy. Now, what Fritz Perls would say is, wait a minute, you can't really feel what he's feeling or what he's doing. What you're doing is you have a part of yourself that's very over-controlling. But you won't acknowledge that, you won't admit that, so you split it off from yourself and you project it onto other people. And you'll often project it onto people that do have some of that trait. But you do this with your boss. You're projecting your own over-controlling tendencies onto your boss. And that's what you are reacting to. You're reacting to that part of yourself that is over-controlling. So what I want you to do, Fritz Perls would say, is the person would be sitting in a chair and Perls would put an empty chair in front of them. And then he would tell the person, take your problem, whatever it is, in this case it's the over-controlling boss, and put it in that chair. And so I want you to actually get in the chair yourself and talk to this over-controlling person. So you move back and forth from chair to chair. Sitting in your chair, you ask it a question. Maybe it's, why are you doing this to me? And then Perls will say, now get in the other chair and answer him. So you get in the other chair, and now you have to identify with this over-controlling boss and answer this person, why are you doing this? And you could say anything. You might say, well, it's because you're no good, or you're a poor worker, or you just don't fit in here, or whatever they say. And then you switch back to your chair and answer that. Well, I'm not that crazy. I mean, I fit in here fine. Just fine, whatever you want to say. And he would have them go back and forth and back and forth. And Pearls famously said, I can cure any neurosis in 15 minutes. 15 minutes. And the thing is, even his critics, people that didn't like him, tended to agree that he could, because they had seen him do it hundreds of times. Within 10 or 15 minutes of playing your boss, of playing this over-controlling person, you are starting to identify with this over-controlling nature. In other words, you're starting to re-identify with that shadow element that you had split off and projected onto your boss. Now, Pearls is having you play the shadow element, and as you continue to play it, you're starting to re-identify with it, because you have to talk as if you actually are this over-controlling boss. And the more you do that, the less that boss will annoy you, and the more your anxiety will go down. And everybody in the audience watching this happen could see this person changing in front of them as they got more relaxed and more easygoing, and they weren't as upset with their boss. And so Pearls was right. He had cured another neurosis in less than 15 minutes. And that's a very good method that he invented to help us spot our own projections. Because all of us have some degree of unconscious qualities or characteristics. And when we push those into our unconscious, the first defense mechanism we use to get away from it is we project it out of ourselves onto somebody else. And so it could be anger, it could be jealousy, it could be rage, it could be sexual attraction, it could be anything. But we'll react to it as if it actually belonged to that person. We projected our shadow onto them. And so what Pearls would have you do is play your shadow element. I want you to actually talk as if you are that person. And people could see them start to re-identify with their shadow element. Everybody in the audience could see this happening. And they would see the person right in front of their eyes get better. They would start to look and feel and act quite differently. And because they had taken back their shadow element, they were now, the over-controlling part had been taken back, re-identified with, and therefore their boss will still be an over-controlling person, but they won't be reacting to it so negatively and with such anxiety and fear and even hatred or aggression. And that's why Pearls was correct when he said, I can cure any neurosis in less than 15 minutes. And he could. And he used this empty chair technique to get the person to re-identify with that which they had projected onto somebody else. And that is a terrific approach. I think it's the best possible approach to generalize neurotic shadow issues. And you can do it yourself if you want. You can put an empty chair in front of you and go back and forth and play, respond, and you'll feel how effective it is. So I recommend that empty chair technique as an important part of growing up psychotherapy. And I highly recommend anybody try it.
These days, the right not to be hurt by emotions becoming as important as the right to be safe from physical violence. Many people suffer because of aggressive unilateral words or actions emotional intelligence is important for peace and happiness of oneself and others. What should I do to improve my emotional intelligence?
Yeah, the best thing you can do is that empty chair projection work that I just described. And you know what I mean by projection work? Did I explain projection good enough where you take some aspect or quality of yourself, you deny that you have that because it has got you into trouble in the past, or it causes you anxiety, or for whatever reason you deny that you have it, and you seal it off in your unconscious, and from there you project it onto others. And since it's actually your own emotion that you're projecting onto others, then they have the power to hurt you because you've given them your emotional existence. So the only emotions, as you say these days, the right not to be hurt by emotions, the only emotions that hurt us are projected shadow emotions. And because if like you're very, let's say, angry, but you don't admit your anger, but you know somebody is angry as hell, so it must be her. She's angry at me, because it's your emotion that's connected to you. So even when you project your arm onto her and see her as being angry, it's still connected to you. So you think she's mad at you. And that hurts because it's your own emotions attacking themselves. And the best way to deal with that is the empty chair, exchanging roles with your projected shadow, with the shadow that you've taken out of yourself and put onto others, projected onto others. And the empty chair is a terrific exercise to reintegrate and heal that split between you and your shadow. And it is your shadow, whether you like it or not. So best that you take it back and re-own it and re-identify with it, and then you'll no longer be afraid of her angrily attacking you, because you realize it's your anger, but you don't have to be angry. You can re-own that anger through the empty chair exercise or some other psychotherapeutic practice. That's what I recommend we do to improve my emotional intelligence.
In the early stages of meditation, it's necessary for the viewers to notice mindfulness that it is clearly separate from the object of observation, away from the object of observation. Furthermore, we know that it is not the phenomenon itself that causes fantasy or pain. In other words, we do not phenomenon itself that causes. We do not see the object as an independent entity separated from the subject, but realize that they are not different. Is there a more efficient way to achieve such enlightenment, not a traditional way of practicing Vipassana, Zen, and Tibetan Buddhism?
Well, let's don't be too quick here. I will answer this question and I'll give you a very clear example. But let's remember that these approaches have been around for several thousand years. And they have lasted so long because they work. And so Zen or Vipassana, early Buddhism, Vipassana, later Buddhism, Zen, And Tibetan Buddhism, also a very integrated school of Buddhism and very profound, in my opinion. But the simplest and easiest and quickest way I'm aware of to realize that the subject is one with the object and that they're not separated is to use that on having no head that Douglas Harding introduced. And I'll run through it again just very quickly. But you notice that you can't really see your head. All you can see is two little pink, fleshy, bulbous parts, which is the two sides of your nose. And that's all of your face you can see. And so Douglas Harding says it's because we have no head. And if you look where you thought your head was, if you try to sort of experience this side of your face, the only thing that's arising in that space is everything you see out here. This is arising right where you thought your head was. And you don't see that wall, you are that wall. It is arising directly where you thought your head was. And as you look around and see things, you notice they all exist in this space where your head used to be, or you thought your head was, but it's not really there. And every subject you think exists in your head is actually one with every object you think is arising out there. Because there is no out there. There's only your head, or what you thought was your head. There's only this vast, open, empty space on this side of your eyes that is not separate. That space is not at all separate from what you're looking at. So right now I'm looking at that wall, and that wall is actually smack on this side of my face. It's one with my awareness on this side of my head. And that subject and object are not two. They're non-dual. They're arising in the same space, which is a space that I thought I had a head. But I can't see that head. It doesn't exist. What exists is everything that I'm looking at. And that's arising exactly where my head used to be. So that's the quickest way I know, especially if it clicks for you and you really get it. It's a very easy way to see that everything I'm looking at is actually one with I who am doing the looking. There's no separation at all because I don't have a head to separate anything. And all I have arising where I thought my head was is the entire scenario of what I'm looking at. And the subject and object are not two. They're non-dual. And that's the basic message of the world's mystics, is I am everything that I'm now looking at. I am one with the entire world that I'm aware of. And that oneness is known as the ground of all being. And it's a oneness that's occurring because I don't actually have a head. I can actually touch it. So that's the simplest and quickest way I know to see that subject and object are not two. Is to realize that we really don't have a head. That where we thought our head was is the entire world that I'm looking at.
You said humans have a different ultimately interested in each of the 8 stages of growth: food and survival in the first ancient stage, sex and emotional pleasure in the second magic stage, power and safety in the third magic mist stage, love and compromise belonging in the fourth mist, achievement and excellence in the fifth national stage, or rational stage, and sensitivity and consideration in the sixth plural stage. This is the first floor. From the seventh stage is the second floor. The seventh stage is affectionate acceptance and inclusion, and the third layer in the stage of integration, which deal with pure self transcendence and totality that increase at each level. Did you go through this process when you grow up? How to grow more efficiently without going through this step by step?
Well, the answer is you can't. And did I go through these stages? Yes, I did. The reason you can't skip stages is I'd like you to count from 1 to 10, but leave out 4, 5, and 6. Can you do it? No. That's because each stage follows the previous stage. And in growing up, each stage actually becomes a small part of the succeeding stage. So each stage is what we say transcend and include. So it's really like a series of concentric spheres, each one embracing its predecessors, surrounding it, and going beyond it by being a bigger sphere. And you can't take out any of those spheres because it rips a hole in the middle of the concentric sphere creation. And our stages of growth and development all go beyond their previous stage, but they also include it. So it's like pennies or parts of nickels or parts of dimes, parts of quarters, parts of dollars, and parts of $10 bills, and so on. Each one actually enfolds its previous stage. And that's why you can't pull out any of them, because you just rip apart this series of concentric spheres that are all growing and adding as they continue to transcend and include. So, does that make sense? But that's the basic answer. For the same reason that you can't skip 4, 5, and 6 when you count from 1 to 10. Because 4, 5, and 6 are an integral part of that sequence. They are inclusive steps in that overall procedure. And if you pull out any one of them, you tear out all the succeeding ones because you stop the growth. You're just no longer including it, so its growth doesn't continue. It can't. So we have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. And all of them are required. And you can't yank out any of them and still count from integers 1 to 10. So it's just sort of the way things are. It's what we're made of.
I got it.
Yeah. Another great job.
Now, psychologically challenged people say, there's no way I'm going to do well. I'm right to be ignored. That interrupts his happiness, freedom, and peace in this way, and suffers from a whisper of unconsciousness like a curse. You called this an inner critic. How to get away with it?
By which you mean how to get away from it. Right. Well, basically, it's mindfulness with judgment. So what you want to do, in other words, is watch your inner stream of thoughts, and when you find this inner critic speaking up, you just be aware of it, but you judge it as, I don't want to do that. I want to get rid of that inner critic. And you just keep that mindfulness with that judgment up. And as long as the inner critic shows up, you're going to be aware of it, and you're going to judge it as negative, as I don't want that as part of myself. And if you do it with mindful awareness, then you won't repress it. You won't split it off from awareness. You're being aware of it. And so it will just stay there. And as you judge it negatively, it'll start to get the picture. And it'll stop speaking so loudly or so often or so regularly. And it'll just start to die down. But you have to do it with mindfulness plus that judgment. They're both very important ingredients in this process. But it works all the time if you do that. It will get rid of your inner critic.
You also wrote a love story that you felt while nursing take care of your wife, Bettria,
Right.
who died of cancer for 5 years in a book called Grace and Grit.
Right.
Cancer pain or the reality that we have to eventually die is hard enough. But patients and their families often struggle more with psychological pain. What do you want to tell them?
Basically, the response is love. Just simply love. And love anything and everything. It's an unconditional love. And that means you love your pain, you love your illness, you love whatever negative is arising. You don't push it away, you don't try to hide it, you just love it. You're one with it. Because love basically is to be one with a thing you love. You want to embrace that person or that thing. You want to include it. You want to integrate it. And so when you love, it's also, it's another way of talking about having no head. Because when you love everything that you're aware of, and you really love it, then you're becoming one with it. Because that's why you love it. You feel this oneness with it. And ultimately, you're one with everything because you are the ground of all being. Your real self is this ground of all being. And that's just another way of saying is love. Because it embraces and loves everything that arises. Most of the other ways that I've been talking about are sort of non-emotional ways, like witnessing or having no head. And so I just stated them all, and they're all kind of bland and boring. But love is a real feeling. It's a real emotion that you have. And most people can get a sense of their loving nature. And if you do that and you bring that love up and add it to this oneness with everything that's arising, then that will spill over into your pain and into how you view your illness. And with that loving approach, you can embrace all of life's problems. And that was what basically made Treya such an extraordinary person, is she had this abundant, overflowing love for everybody and everything. She even ended up being able to love her cancer. And I watched her go through extraordinarily vicious pain. And yet she would get to the place where she would just love it. She would embrace it. She'd say, come on, have at it. And it would never overwhelm her. It would never knock her off her stride because she was in love. And love, an old saying has it, love cures all. And because love embraces all. And this is just another way of what we've been talking about all along, which is this ultimate unified ground of all being. Well, that's another word for love. Love of all being. So That's what I recommend for dealing with that problem. And it'll spill over into all areas of your life. And you'll find yourself loving everything that arises, including pain or even cancer.
The irrationality of Korean pseudo religion in the Netflix documentary I Am God shocked viewers. The cults used believers as slaves, extorting money, fulfilling sexual desires, and enslaving them like feudal emperors. Why do you think many people are still easily misled by such a pseudo cults?
It's standard wish fulfillment, which is an inbred human trait. We are just willing to embrace the silliest number of things if we can also attach them to something good that's going to come because we believe them. And people are wonderfully willing to do that. And it's just a wish fulfillment. It's a wish they have, and they can see it fulfilled by this cult, or so the cult says, and so they jump. You can't hold them back. You don't have to push them into it. You can't stop them. It's a human trait to do this kind of stuff. And it has led to more human misery than I can recount. But it is definitely an inborn human trait.
Question. Korea is the only country in the East where Christianity is most prevalent in a short time. It is not Buddhism, but Protestant that has the largest number of believers in Korea.
More than half of the world's 50 largest churches are in Korea.
That's astonishing.
Yeah. They are conservative and they have a strong fundamental
Right.
tendency. I would have been burned at the stake by church leaders if I had been born in the Middle Ages because I criticized countless large mega church pastors and religious leaders who sold tend to use Jesus to fulfill their desires and gain power. You would have been punished if you were born in Middle Ages because you also denied the traditional Christian God. If your interview goes out, it's likely that comment will be posted there. You have not experienced the living God, the Holy Spirit. What would you say if people say that you have not experienced the living God, the Holy Spirit, so accepted Jesus as a Savior and recommended you to experience the living Holy Spirit and receive salvation?
Right. Well, you said yourself that they have a strong fundamentalist tendency. And the problem with fundamentalism is that it's created during the childhood of humankind. So virtually all fundamentalist religions are composed of pre-operational magic and mythic modes of thinking. And so they all say that they've experienced the living God, but the God they're talking about is Zeus or Apollo or even Aphrodite. It's something that they first thought of when they were 5 years old or 6 years old or 7 years old, or at least their teachings come from that age period of magic and mythic belief structures. I believe those fundamentalist religions to the same extent that I believe in any mythic god. Do I believe in Zeus? Well, Yeah, I believe there is a mythic god named Zeus, and he lives on top of Mount Olympus. And I mean, I understand all of that. Do I actually believe it's real and exists someplace? No. That's a fundamentalist magic and mythic belief. And it's not the experience of a real living God. This is coming from just one religion. And as you say in your next question, a person who knows only one religion is a person who does not know any religion. And that's true. All these fundamentalist Christians only know Christianity. None of them have ever heard anything about Hinduism or Vedanta or about Buddhism or about Taoism. You mention those and they just get a blank stare in their face. And that's the problem with all fundamentalist religions. It's because they're created out of magic and mythic elements, they were the first types of major belief systems that humans developed as they went to their own 4, 5, and 6-year-old historical epics. They thought of magic and magic mythic gods. And they had the same reality as any magic or mythic element does today. The same reality as Zeus or Apollo or Aphrodite or Mars and so on. They just have no substance. And that allows them to believe sort of any way that they want because they're just dealing with myths. And you can make up any sort of myth. I mean, if you're going to say, I believe in Zeus living on Mount Olympus, I can say anything I want, and you're going to have to believe that. I mean, if Zeus is really on Mount Olympus, then so is Aphrodite, and so is Apollo, and so are all the other mythic figures. And all of them have exactly the same real reality basis, which is none. They just aren't really real. But you can't tell a 5 or 6-year-old that their mythic Zeus or Apollo isn't real because they firmly believe it. They just know that it's real. They talk to it or they pray to it or they see it each and every day. And that's a fundamentalist religious belief. And fundamentalist, in this case, means most fundamental, which means the earlier stages of a developmental sequence are more fundamental because they're more basic, but they're also more childish or more childlike or more less grown. And so all fundamentalist religion, and by the way, probably a slight majority of the world's religions are fundamentalist versions. So even religions that have powerful mystical elements, like Buddhism in Japan, or Taoism in China, or Vedanta in India, they all have their earlier versions, their fundamentalist childhood versions. And like I say, you find those even amongst truly mystical religions. But if you ask a Zen master, is Zeus a real figure? That Zen master will say, not in my book. I don't see it. And yet he is directly aware, if he's a real Zen master, of this ultimate ground of all being, because he's one with it. And he knows that. He's experienced that oneness directly. So that's the difficulty with fundamentalist religions, is virtually none of them have a mystical, direct experience of an ultimate living, real God. They just have their magic beliefs and their mythic beliefs, all of which developed by the type of thinking that they had when they were 2 years old to 7 years old. And that's just all that can be said for that type of belief structure.
You say concentration, not awareness, brings self-contraction and pause to recognize the whole picture. That's right. As Max Muller, the founder of religious studies, said, a person who knows only one religion is a person who does not know any religion. The view of the person who knows only one religion is narrow. A person with a broad and high perspective is called a saint or sage. However, in fact, a person who strives and is observed with the one desire he has chosen achieves great achievement. It said that if we want it badly, the universe will help. There is a saying that when you dig a well, don't dig from place to place, but dig only one until the end. Even if we read a book, there are people who want you to look at only one field deeply, and people who need to look at various things broadly. What would you advise on this?
Well, again, it's a combination of both of these factors. So what I would recommend to the person who's saying this is, well, why don't you open up to the real universe? The universe is a universe, a one song, a one tune, a one melody. And that's right, it is one single ground of all being, as we've said many times. And there's room in that wholeness for both of these approaches. Because, I mean, it's true in a certain sense that if you're going to dig a well, only dig in one spot. But that's not the only thing you're going to do in the world. It's just dig one well after another well after another well, because there are going to be things that you want to do one or two or three of simultaneously together. And that needs to be honored. The problem with fundamentalist religions, the person who knows only one religion is a person who does not know any religion, is if you study several religions, you're likely to hit at least one of them, like, say, Zen Buddhism, which isn't basically a fundamentalist religion. Zen is a real, genuine, mystical, inclined experience of a Satori. And that is a profoundly important discovery. And so what happens when we go and look at one religion, we might get its fundamentalist version because it's the most accessible or popular. And then we look at another religion, we get another fundamentalist religion. And then we look at something like Zen or contemplative Taoism, and we find a genuine mystical religion. And they don't believe in anything the fundamentalists do. So as I said, if you say to a Zen master, well, do you believe that everything is created by Jehovah? And he also didn't have sex with a human woman, but he did somehow get her pregnant, and she bore his one and only son. The Zen master will go, you're nuts. You actually believe that silliness? And therefore, if you're going from fundamentalist Christianity to fundamentalist Judaism to mystical Zen, you're going to at least have hit one reality among the whole lot of things you're studying. So that's why a person who's only studied one religion hasn't really studied religion, doesn't really know the real aspects of religion. And the more religions you examine, the greater your likelihood of finding a genuine, real, mystical, Satori religion. And when you find that, you'll almost certainly see that there's a great deal of truth in it, because it just rings right. When you read what a Zen master says, he sounds like he's making sense. Whereas if you listen to Billy Graham or some other fundamentalist Christian preacher, they don't make sense at all. Again, they're saying, well, we have this one and only biological son of the one and only creator of the entire universe. And, oh, he, by the way, was crucified on a cross for something we're not sure exactly why, but he did deserve it. He did get it crucified on the cross. And most people, if they're thinking clearly, just find this sole biological son of the one and only creator of the entire universe to be absolutely unbelievable. I mean, why did God deliver Christ in a very small Middle Eastern nation, and a nation which, by the way, has no oil whatsoever? So way to go, God. That was a wonderful choice. And he just lived in that Galilee region his entire life, and he was crucified there. And then 3 days later, he arose and actually came back to life. And several people witnessed this, supposedly. Certainly his main female, possibly even wife, Mary Magdalene, experienced the risen Jesus. But most people find the whole story convoluted and difficult and fundamentalist and childish. And it is fundamentalist and childish. That's the definition of a fundamentalist religion, is it goes back to your roots in childhood, or at least the way you were thinking in childhood, magically or mythically. So what I would advise to that is that the person open up to the real world, that there are some things that require a single, focused, steady approach, like digging a well, and many other things, like building a car, which don't or won't work if you just use one single approach to reality. You have to include thousands of different parts in a real car. And that's an important thing to do. It's part of the universe, the one song. So
you said that as the people of Earth passed through the first mystic conformist stages and reached the 5 rational modern stages, the French Revolution and the American Revolution took place, representative democracy began, and the American Constitution was created. You said that 10% of the Earth's population will experience the most profound tipping point in human history when it reaches the integrated stage. When will it reach 10%? And what do you expect to happen then?
Well, I think it'll still be a fair amount of time, maybe around 100 years or so. But one of the first things that will happen is we'll simply cease warfare. Most people don't realize how many wars are going on around the world right now. And in fact, historically, it's simply the case that for every 1 year of peace, there have been 13 years of war. That's our history. That's an undeniable fact. And it's a horrifying fact. It means that war is inbred, or at least it's inbred in the early fundamentalist ways of thinking, because when you have a fundamentalist religion, it disagrees with every other fundamentalist religion on the planet. And if you bring them together into close proximity, they'll end up fighting each other because they don't agree with each other's version of God. And if you don't believe my God, you are worthless. You don't believe in God? How dare you? I'm going to pull out my knife and stab you, or my gun and shoot you. All of that type of warfare will come to an end because we will truly be awakened to that universe, that one world that's fully integrated and fully unified. And we would have no reason to want to start a war under those circumstances. So that, I think, the awakening to a truly integral world will be one of the most important things that happens in all of human history. And like I said, I think it will still be a while, maybe around 100 years, simply because we still have so much warfare going on around the planet. We're still living in the trace of this 1 year of peace, 13 years of war. And that's a brutal characteristic to inherit. And it certainly is still playing out in horrible ways around the world. So I think that will fortunately be one of the first things that goes, is our fundamentalist warfare. Well, I'm sorry, but it's our own past that we're dealing with, not my idea.
You read Lao Tzu's Moral Sutra and said that you were passionate by Eastern and West ideas and reached this point. What part of Eastern philosophy shocked you at the time?
Well, at the time that I first ran into Eastern philosophy in a fairly deep way, I was in my early to mid-teens. So I was 14 or 15. And when I was between 15 and 16, I had my first Satori, or unified experiential awareness. But the thing that shocked me a year or two prior to that was essentially the no-self doctrine of most Eastern religions, particularly Buddhism, but also Advaita, Vedanta, and Taoism and Hinduism. But the fact that there wasn't really anybody in here controlling what was going on was just shocking to me. I couldn't quite figure it out. And until several years later, when I had a Satori experience and realized that yes, there is a relative self and I do have it, but it's not my real self. My real self is this big mind witnessing awareness. And that's who and what I really am. And by the way, there's only one of those selves. Everybody has that one real self. And it's definitely one with the one real ground of all being. And I can look out of this face and be one with everything I'm looking at. Because among other things, I don't have a head. I mean, I'm really, there's everything I'm aware of right now is a non-dual reality. And that's one way of saying I don't have a head. I have no head doctrine. But whether we refer to it as a no head or not, it is a oneness. We are one with everything we're aware of. We don't have, as a real self, a separate individual itty-bitty self that sits behind my eyes and looks out at all these objects and moves my arms and legs and is in control of my body and movements and all of that. There just is no small self, not as a real self, not as my true identity. It just doesn't exist. It isn't there. And the whole aim of Buddhism was to get you to this anatta, no self realization. That was the whole purpose of the entire bloody religion, is to get you over this small self. It's actually called the anatta, the no self doctrine. And it's basically all that Buddha taught was this anatta doctrine, this no self doctrine. And so I immediately fell in love with Buddhism. And the more I looked into Buddhism, the more it all sort of led to the Zen-like forms of Buddhism. So I immediately found me a Zen master and started practicing. And I was actually assigned a koan by mail from Edo Roshi, who's a very famous, very highly accomplished Zen master. And I had read the Lankavatara Sutra, which is the sutra that Bodhidharma, the Chinese founder of Zen Buddhism, gave to his disciple, and his disciple gave it to his disciple, and they passed the Lankavatara Sutra down to the first 6 major Zen teachers. And it's a very profound sutra, and it's a very long sutra, and I read it all and just devoured it. And every time I would write a Zen master asking if they would accept me as their student, I would always, for some reason, just get into a very long, many-page summary of the Lankavatara Sutra. Because I thought if I demonstrated to them that I knew the Lankavatara Sutra, which is the sutra that founded Zen Buddhism, that they would find me an acceptable student. And so I would go, well, let me tell you about the Lankavatara Sutra, next page, next page, and 5 or 6 pages I would write the Lankavatara Sutra. And finally, one Zen master assigned me the koan Mu, which is probably the most widely used koan in all of Zen Buddhism. And a koan, for those of you who are not aware of it, is generally described as a story or a statement about Zen that doesn't make rational sense. And you're supposed to answer the question the Zen master asks you about this non-rational story. So a standard, very famous Zen koan is, what's the sound of one hand clapping? The most famous one is from the Zen master known as Joshu. And he was asked, the Zen koan reads in its entirety, a student asked Zen master Joshu, does a dog have Buddha nature? Now, everybody who studies Buddhism knows that every dog, every animate animal has Buddha nature. So the correct answer is yes. But the koan reads, a student asks Zen master Joshu, does a dog have Buddha nature? Joshu said, mu, which is Japanese for no. And so the Zen master says, what is this mu? And you have to go away and meditate until you figure out what the hell mu is. And then, by the way, the answer that you give the Zen master when he asks what is mu is you say mu. And that's it. And he can tell by how you say it if you are one with it or not. I mean, it's a fairly easy thing to spot, but a Zen master can certainly spot it. And so he gave me this koan, and I meditated on it for several years, and I actually got it. I cracked it. And when I wrote him my response, I did just write mu. And that apparently was good enough, and so he passed my Satori. But there's got to be something for the Zen history books, a koan assigned by mail. So I was delighted by it. But that's my Zen koan story. Yeah, I think the reason the no self doctrine sort of shocked me was that the culture I was brought up in was self-focused. You were supposed to have self-esteem. You were supposed to be self-accomplished, self-possessed, self-certified. And we have such a culture of selfhood that when I learned that that entire culture was based on an illusion of this small, itty-bitty self in my head controlling everything that I do or think or say, and it doesn't exist, it isn't there, that was kind of surprised. I was a little bit shocked by that. And then the more, of course, I got into mysticism, and the more I read almost all of the world's great religions, most of which I loved the mystical track too, and the fundamentalist track of all of them I found ridiculous, equally ridiculous. They were all based on the thinking of a 4, 5, or 6-year-old, and I found all of them ridiculous. Even the Zen, although it's very hard to find a Zen fundamentalist childhood version, but there are some Zen people that talk that way, and I find them just as ridiculous. So the no-self doctrine was a bit of a shocker, but within several years, I had accepted it as ultimate reality, that I had a real self that wasn't this small self I could see. When I looked within and I could see myself, who was looking? Who was looking at this small self? That was my real self. That was the witness. That was the big self. That was what Suzuki Roshi called big mind. And it was just that. It was a big mind. It encompassed the entire universe and held it within. And I was one with that entire universe in my big mind. And Suzuki Roshi, who was the head of the San Francisco Zen Center for many years, was a brilliant Zen master. He really had a profound impact on America and on many, many, many American students that he had. He actually published a few books. One was called Zen Mind, Beginner's Mind, and he introduced the topic of big mind, which is your real mind, and of which there's only one in the entire universe, and we all participate in it. But he gave frequent lectures and talks, and he, above all, taught Zen meditation. And so all of his students were looking to get and express a Satori. And Satori, for some reason, sort of became the linchpin of what I would consider to be a real religion. First of all, Satori is a mystical oneness with everything. And you experience that oneness yourself. You are one with everything. And when you experience that, you even know what the sound of one hand clapping is, because you include that. By the way, the sound of one hand clapping is just that. You just put out your one hand facing the Zen master, and he'll accept it if you really get it. He can see if you really get it. But the no-self was a shocker, and I'm glad I quickly got over that shock and moved on to genuinely mystical unities and mystical big mind. And that's still basically to this day my fundamental orientation to the world. And it stood me well. A lot of good things have happened to me because of those experiences and the belief structure that they build. So here we all are. And that's thanks to my no self experience.